Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We will begin with code workshop number 2, and we'll begin with just some brief introductions. We have some um, potentially new faces for some of you joining in person, as well as here on Zoom. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Luisa Leite. I'm a project manager and town planner with Dover Kohl Partners. We have a couple of other people from our consultant team um, on Zoom. Justin, if you want to say hello, and then we'll pass it on to you all in person.
Hey everyone, I'm with Dover Kohl, architect and town planner.
Great, thanks, Justin. Victor Dover and Bill Spakowski are also joining us live in person from Punta Gorda. I'll note also that we have a couple of folks from city staff who are with us on Zoom. There's Mitchell Austin, Chief City Planner, as well as Melissa Reichert. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So right now we're in the code framework part of this process. We're updating the land development regulations, in particular, creating a new form-based code for the greater downtown area. We'll show you what that area looks like in just a second. We had our first code workshop last Tuesday. We've also been having a series of technical meetings. So once we're through with this code framework workshop, we'll begin drafting the first draft of the new form-based code. And that will hopefully be completed sometime in the fall. And that's when we'll do our second round of intense public input. So once that first draft is finished, we'll be coming back to do a public presentation and a pinup or open house to really get into some of the details of what we're proposing in the new code. We'll also be testing that code in a couple of sample sites to get an idea of how it works and what the resulting developments might look like in different types of lots in this form-based code area. And that will allow us, after that second round of public input, we'll make revisions to the code, and that'll get us to a final draft by the end of this year, with the goal of going to adoption hearings in late winter or spring of 2022. So for those of you who are not familiar with this process, we began in 2019 with the citywide master plan document and public process. We had a design charrette, lots of public meetings, gathering input. We then moved on to phase 2, which is updating the city's comprehensive plan. We got through the first draft of the comprehensive plan amendments and took a pause so we could focus our attention on the land development regulations. And so now we're looking to actually adopt both the land development regulation updates and the comprehensive plan updates together. So now I'll go on to a brief summary of code workshop number 1. So the focus of last week's meeting was to talk very briefly about what land development regulations are and why communities update them. And so Punta Gorda is updating their land development regulations for many, many reasons that many other communities also cite when they're updating theirs. And that includes things like creating more walkable and bikeable neighborhoods. We're updating them to encourage development and diversify and strengthen the city's tax base, to ensure high quality redevelopment is feasible, to address any flood hazards, new flood hazards, and changing flood hazards, to preserve historic assets and neighborhoods and encourage more diverse housing options, but also to conform with any comprehensive plan changes that we're also doing in this parallel process, which is phase 2, and make the code as easy to use and enforce as possible. Like we mentioned last week, land development regulations, for those of you who are new, are all of the rules that define the procedures and standards for the development, use, and subdivision of land. That includes a number of regulations from your PUD, which are your planned unit development ordinances, any design guidelines, zoning district rules, other regulations like impact fees, and sign ordinances. And in some communities, they combine all of those different rules into what's called a unified land development code, which just consolidates anything related to subdivision, zoning, and development regulations and procedures. Punta Gorda does not have a unified land development code. It has a number of chapters throughout its code of ordinances that touch upon these types of rules from code enforcement, which is regulated in Chapter 9, to development impact fees in Chapter 11, and all the way to Chapter 26, which are the land development regulations, which we'll be primarily focused on. And I just want to summarize kind of why we're looking at creating a form-based code as opposed to just a conventional zoning code like the one Punta Gorda already has. So some of the benefits of the form-based code is that it's a highly visual document. It's a lot easier to understand. It's more user-friendly in general. It also gives you better predictability and control over the character and quality of development. We're still regulating all the things that a conventional code would, like land use and height, density, but we're stricter about certain things like what the building actually looks like, what the architectural elements are. It also allows us to be more fine-grained in defining unique building and place types. So we can get very specific about the kinds of development and what that should look like along specific streets or in front of certain parks and open spaces. Another great thing about form-based codes is that they allow for a more streamlined development process. What we're doing right now, which is meeting with the public and stakeholders, is key to creating a more streamlined development process. Having this conversation before you update the code is crucial. It allows us to write the rules first from the beginning, ensuring that the regulations both reflect what the community wants to see, as well as what property owners and developers want to build or can build and what's feasible for them to build, and trying to calibrate that beginning at the beginning before we write the rules, so that once the rules are in place, you actually see redevelopment happen, and that redevelopment is something that the community wants. So some of the ways to improve on the existing regulations are to update the actual development standards and districts, and that's what we're going to focus on today's presentation. And that includes improving any current elements in the code that are hindering the quality, variety, and viability of new development, as well as updating the language, format, and organization so that the document is as easy to understand, implement, and enforce as possible. So the existing land development regulations can be found in Chapter 26 of the city's Code of Ordinances, and there's a number of articles within it. The ones we're most interested in this update, we will focus most of our attention are, of course, regulating districts. These are the actual zoning districts and the development standards that apply to each of those districts. That, and when I say development standards, I mean height and setbacks and lot coverage. Also, the uses permitted in each district, the rules that govern plan development, architectural provisions, streets, landscaping and sign standards, and then the actual application review and approval process. Tonight, specifically, we're going to be focusing on Article 3 and Article 7, which are the regulating districts and development standards and the architectural provisions. So here's the existing zoning map. This is the area where the new form-based code will be focused in. And the underlying districts that exist today in this area include primarily the city center zoning district, neighborhood residential, special purpose, highway commercial, and neighborhood center. The things we want to address when updating the regulations, like I mentioned, is correcting any elements that are hindering the quality, variety, and viability of new development. And that includes eliminating any inconsistencies between the actual development standards and the permitted uses and intent and existing character of the actual underlying district. We also want to correct any provisions that are currently making it very difficult or impossible to build mixed use developments. And we want to correct the weak architectural provisions that aren't currently guaranteeing good results and sometimes even conflict with some development standards. And so this is specifically what we'll focus our meeting today on. But that other reason that we're updating is, of course, to make the code as easy to understand as possible. And that includes adding things like summary tables and diagrams, illustrations that help take these words and these rules and bring them to life so that people can understand them better. We did a couple of exercises last week with the community, and these are both now online as well in a more detailed version. And the first one was about building types. So we want to get an understanding of what building types are appropriate and where. And that will help us understand how we have to rewrite the rules to make sure that those types of buildings are actually allowed and encouraged. And the second exercise was focused on development intensity hierarchy. So what intensity of development is appropriate along what streets throughout the form-based code area? And when we say intensity, and we know this can get a little confusing, intensity is a general term that planners use, and it includes height, it includes density, although residential density applies only to residential developments. And so density is not a measure of intensity for non-residential buildings. And so when we're talking about non-residential buildings, measures of intensity include height, they include lot coverage, setbacks, frontage areas, all these other tools. So you can think of it as a long equation with lots of different variables that actually end up impacting the overall size and bulk of a building. So like I mentioned, these exercises are also online, and we're going to keep them online for the next couple of weeks to make sure everyone has a chance to give us their input about building types and about development intensity. And these are all preliminary surveys. It's just for us to get a sense, a temperature of how people are feeling. They're still going to be refined and changed as we start drafting that first draft of the code. So as I mentioned, we also had a series of technical framework meetings this week. So in addition to the public input we're gathering at these meetings and through those surveys, these technical meetings allowed us to speak with local experts and stakeholders who will be directly impacted by the new form-based code. And this includes this included a housing roundtable to talk about housing options and the needs around housing by the local nonprofits and the housing authority. We also had a meeting focused on discussing the historic district, as well as a meeting with local businesses, local home builders, developers, uh, medical district representatives, including representatives from the hospital, waterfront development, and local community groups as well. So what happens next? Like I mentioned, we're going to be using the general input we get from the surveys to help us start building the framework of the new code. And together with all the input we've gathered from the Q&A sessions at these meetings and from all the technical meetings we held, the building type exercise and development intensity, all that helps us start thinking about how we're going to build the first draft of the code. But the next step is to really think more critically about the actual building form and architectural standards. These are the rules that we write to help us control what the development will look like. Once you've calibrated the types of buildings, the uses, and the overall hierarchy of intensity that you want, then we really have to focus on, okay, well, what is the building going to look like? And so that's what we're going to focus our attention on today. So we'll start with a review of Punta Gorda's existing development and architectural standards. Again, the goal here is to get us to that next step and start thinking about what some of the shortcomings of the existing development standards are in the existing code and how we can improve upon those. So in all communities, there are rules to what can happen when you develop land. And conventional zoning began in the 1920s, and it was primarily put in place to control land use, so what's actually happening inside the buildings. And that was a result of the Industrial Revolution and not wanting to have noxious industrial type uses next to where people are living. In time, zoning codes were amended to include additional rules for building bulk, which includes things like the height of the building and the overall size or footprint of the building. Then rules were added for minimum lot sizes, setbacks, and parking requirements. In time, the codes became more sophisticated and communities started to add things like signage standards and landscape standards. And some communities also started to adopt historic district guidelines and architectural guidelines. And historic guidelines are used to help preserve the character of a particular historic neighborhood. Architectural guidelines are written to help ensure a particular style. Still, even for communities that have these types of guidelines in place and the basic rules for zoning and development, a lot of communities are not happy with the development results that they get. And a part of this is because guidelines, architectural guidelines and even historic district guidelines are not regulatory. And so they're written as recommendation. And so we call them soft regulations or soft rules because they're not really rules, they're just guidelines. And compliance is not required. Now, with form-based code, we can actually implement architectural standards. And these are actually mandatory. So any developer would need a variance to not comply with them. And the existing code does have in Article 7, Chapter 26, what is called architectural provisions. These are very high level and broad at this point. So they're not actually giving planners and staff a great way of controlling what the buildings look like. So I'll go quickly through a summary of some of the existing development standards. We put together this summary table based on the rules that are in the existing code, focusing only on the existing zoning districts in the area of study. And I don't want you all to go crazy looking at this table because I know it's a lot of information, but I'll just have you focus on the first column on the left. So these are some of the the key development standards currently in the existing zoning that are used to control the overall bulk of development. And that includes height. In some places, there's both a minimum and a maximum height specified. Then there's density, which again only applies to residential development, and that means the number of units per acre. Then there are setbacks, and that includes front setbacks, and in some places, both minimum and maximum front setbacks, rear setbacks, side setbacks, and setbacks for detached garages. Now, in the city center and neighborhood center districts, there's also something called encroachments. And this means how far certain building elements can project beyond those setbacks that were previously established. There are also rules that regulate the lot sizes. So some cases there are minimum lot areas. There's also minimum lot widths in feet and lot coverage. Now, none of the districts in the form-based code area today have actually maximum lot coverage. There's a couple of other districts in your zoning code that do specify lot coverage, but not in these districts specifically. And then there's also frontage build out. That means what percentage of the main principal front of your building, of your lot, is covered by a building. So if you have an 100-foot wide lot, that means your building would have to be at least 70 feet in width. And then there's, like I mentioned, Article 7, which are the architectural provisions. And all of the existing zoning districts in our area of study do have some form of architectural provisions. And a lot of these will be updating as we write the first draft of the form-based code. We're evaluating height, we're evaluating density, we're looking at those encroachments. Right now, there's no encroachment specified for residential to control things like how far a porch can extend beyond the face of the building and into the setback area. We're also looking at the minimum widths of lots because that impacts the types of buildings you can build. Say in a neighborhood residential, if you want to allow townhouses, row houses, that 25 minimum width right now would make it impossible to do a 16-foot wide row house, which is a typical width for row houses. So let's focus quickly on neighborhood residential. We're going to go through an example of a typical lot that would be zoned NR10. So here you have a visual of what a typical lot looks like in the NR10 district. And so the minimum lot area is 3,500 square feet. Your minimum lot width at the setback line is 40 feet. And then you have a number of other setbacks that you have to comply with. So this lot is 40 feet wide by 93 feet. It is just over 3,500 square feet. you have your 10-foot minimum front setback and 25-foot maximum setback, which gives you what we've illustrated as the build-to zone. That means the front of this building has to be located somewhere within that build-to zone. You also have the 5-foot setbacks and a 15-foot rear setback. So this white area in the middle of the lot, along with the build-to zone, is the rough location where this building has to be located. So next we want to show you what the maximum building envelope looks like. So this is the absolute biggest building that could be built on this lot, given the rules. So we have the setbacks that are controlling the overall footprint of the building. And then there are the height regulations, which regulate how tall it will be. So the maximum roof pitch is 6 by 12. So the roof can't be any steeper than what we've illustrated. And the maximum height is 35 feet above the base flood elevation. So if we assume that base flood elevation in this example for this lot is 5 feet above grade, then the overall building will actually be 40 feet in height, but it's 35 feet above that 5-foot base flood elevation. And so what we've done is illustrated a single family home that you could build on this typical lot based on how the rules are written today. So you have rules for minimum roof pitch. So at a very minimum, you have to have a gabled roof, and that roof's pitch will be 4 by 12 at a minimum. You also have to have a usable porch that is required, that has a 6-foot minimum depth, and it has to extend 50% of the primary building. In this case, because we have a garage, that primary building is only about 18 feet wide. The main roofs should be symmetrical gables or hip roofs. The attached garage that we've added has to have a door that's maximum of 10 feet in width. And the attached garage also has to be slightly recessed from the main building, though I will say the existing codes, for example, don't specify how far it has to be recessed. And then your main access has to be from the street, and the front entrance has to be raised 2 feet above grade. And so that results, following all those rules, you could get a building that looks like this one. So there's a couple of other additional architectural provisions that any building in the NR 10 district has to comply with. And that includes defining a lot type, which in this case, this is a rear yard lot type. That means the main yard is in the rear of the lot. You also have to have a specific frontage you've defined. In this case, it's porch by requirement. And then you can pick a building style, which in the historic district, there are a couple of styles specified. These can vary. Not all of the styles specified in the historic district guidelines are actually permitted in the architectural provisions, and we'll get into that a little later on in the presentation. And so here's a different kind of single family home that you can also build to comply with the existing regulations. So this roof is 5 by 12. It's still below the maximum roof pitch of 6 to 12. It again has a symmetrical gable or hip roof. It has side yard parking that occupies no more than 25% of the main frontage line. Pedestrian access again is from the street. The entrances are raised 2 feet, and you've defined your frontage and building style as porch and craftsman. And so what we're gonna get you all thinking about is that right now, the way the current regulations are written, both of these homes are permitted in the NR10 and including the historic district. And so the question for us is, how can we ensure that we get buildings that look a little bit more like the one we've illustrated on the right, with a lot more detailing, a lot more character built into it, and a little bit less like the one on the left. Not that there's anything wrong with that one, but if you're trying to get specific character, you may want to have additional provisions that require a minimum width for porches, not just that 50% rule of the main building, because that still resulted in a very small porch in this case. There's also not very many windows looking out onto the street. There's just the one. And so those are all things for us to consider when we're writing the new regulations for the form-based code. And so here's some photos to to keep thinking on this topic, things to consider when we're drafting the new regulations. So these are homes that are clearly trying to conform with some traditional or vernacular style of architecture, but they kind of just missed the mark. And so these are the kinds of things that oftentimes the rules are not good at catching or avoiding the way they're written. So like I mentioned, having awkward window placing or awkward window sizing and proportions that result in more of a blank wall facing the sidewalk and main entry, or having the main door recessed from the rest of the building. In some cases, having the door that's not visible from the sidewalk or the street. There's also some odd building additions or architectural elements. You can see that second floor addition on the home on the left. It's not quite a dormer, creates quite a different roof line to that building. So these are all the details that really make a difference. So now let's look at an example in the city center. So here we've taken a corner lot as an example. And so this lot is 50 feet wide by 120 feet deep. And city center does not have quite as many lot rules. It's more permissive. So the minimum lot width is 16 feet, but that's only for attached housing. So if we're not doing attached housing, there is no minimum lot width. And there are a few setbacks we have to comply with. The minimum setback is 0 feet from the front and a maximum of 10 feet from the front. So that gives us that build to zone again. And then there's a rear setback of 20 feet, and there are no side setbacks. And so again, thinking about the maximum building envelope, what is the absolute biggest building you could get on this site? So again, that would be 50 feet above the base flood elevation. And here again, we're assuming that the base flood elevation puts you around 5 feet above the actual grade. And then there's some encroachments. So you can extend beyond that setback line by 5 feet on either frontage for elements like balconies or arcades, galleries, and awnings. So here's an example of a building you could build given the existing rules in the existing code. You have a minimum frontage build out of 70%. That means at least 70% of your primary frontage has to be the actual building. Then the windows have to be a square vertical proportion. That's something that's defined in Article 7, which is called architectural provisions. Parking should be located in the rear or the side of the building. The first floor has to have at least 50%, must be comprised at least 50% of windows and doors, although the total facade of the buildings cannot exceed 45% glass. There's also a regulation that no frontage can remain unpierced by a window for more than 16 feet. And it also requires you to change the roof design, the door rhythm, or the materials every 150 feet along the frontage. Now, of course, that's the type of rule that would never apply to a building like this because this building is only 50 feet wide. So one of the things to notice is there aren't any requirements in the code about how the windows actually occur, what the rhythm of the windows and doors look like. So you can get very awkward spacing of windows that result from the existing code. So here's a different example of two mixed-use buildings that you could also build and meet the existing development standards and architectural provisions. And so these are defining and have a lot more character. You can see that there's regular and symmetrical windows and doors along the fronts of the building. They have a regular rhythm or pattern. The awnings have more character. They're extending a much longer part of the building to shade people from the street. There's some additional architectural elements that have been incorporated. And so again, we have to think about what additional rules and standards can we set to ensure that we can get specific types of buildings that really fit into the character of Punta Gorda and the historic character of Punta Gorda. So that we're not getting buildings like the one on the left where the windows are kind of all over the place and you end up with a really dinky little awning and a building that just doesn't have quite as much character as it could. And so here's an example of what happens sometimes when the rules haven't been written well enough. The building on the right, again, that's a mixed use building. There's retail on the bottom and what looks to be office on the second floor. And like I mentioned, there are existing rules that require you to add vertical architectural elements to break up wide and big buildings like you see with those pilasters on the left, but that can sometimes become very monotonous. So we have to make sure we write the rules so that we're not getting very overly long buildings that look quite monotonous and repetitive. And then you can also see again some of the issues with how upper story windows are placed, how big they are, how wide some of the buildings are. When that example on the right, you can see how the roof is varying quite a bit. The awnings don't quite align in each of the buildings as well. So now we're going to get to the heart of what Martha's question was, which is how do we actually get those traditional buildings, not just preserving the historic buildings that we have that remain, but actually make sure that we're building the types of buildings that we'll want to preserve in the future. And the two ways to do that are to improve the basic development standards associated with each of the underlying zoning districts. So those are the standards we kind of went through in the last portion of the presentation: your height, your setbacks, your density, so that you can build like people built traditionally. It's important to note that the historic buildings in Punta Gorda were built before most of the current regulations were in place. And the second thing we have to do is to adopt clear architectural standards instead of just broad guidelines. Right now, the city has a couple of architectural provisions that are required in Article 7, but they're very general, very high level. And then there are also the historic district guidelines, which are non-regulatory. So there's not actually any mechanism to enforce those as they're currently written. And so the following are things that can be specified and controlled with the development standards in the new form-based code. One of the first is building footprint and location using rules like lot coverage and build to lines. We can also control the primary and secondary massing using rules for height, the distance, separation between buildings, the size of secondary massings. We can control things like projections, what the balconies look like, what the different roof elements look like, including dormers. We can control the building type components. So what elements of the building have to be included, what type of entryway, what kind of porch, the windows, and then parking and driveway size and location. So I'm going to quickly go through these, and I know there's a lot on these slides, but we just want to show some examples of the types of illustrations we can use to really get the results that we want. So I'll start with one standard, which is the standards that control placement and height of buildings. And there's a number of things we use. Like I mentioned, build to lines. You remember in the diagrams, we showed what that build to zone is. And that is defined by a minimum and maximum setback. We use things like building height, lot width, and lot coverage, which, as I mentioned earlier, lot coverage is not currently being used in the code, and it can be very useful in controlling the overall size of the building that ends up being built. And the diagrams that you see on the right are illustrating all those different measures, all the different numbers associated with specific lots in a specific area. So another thing we control for is building massing. And typically a conventional code will just give you a couple setbacks that result in a general area where a building is located. But we can get into more specifics. We can say, okay, what are the rules for the main building, the primary building? What's the maximum width and depth of the building? We can go a step further and say, okay, well, what's the maximum combined width or depth for the building and a secondary massing, a projection, or a side building, an offshoot of the main structure. So all these different rules get into a lot more specifics about what the actual overall mass of the building will look like. Another useful tool we have is to identify setbacks above a certain floor. So say you're in a transition zone where the lot is located adjacent to single family residence, but on the other side of it, more intense uses are allowed. And so you want to make sure in certain areas that you're transitioning from areas of very low intensity, like single family residential and potentially a city center. And one of the ways we can make that transition more seamless is to have setbacks above a certain height. So the diagram on the bottom right, you'll see that the third floor of that building is pushed back from the street. It's pushed further back away from where the first and second floor walls are located. So when you're driving along a street or walking along the sidewalk, uh, that third floor is not going to be immediately visible. And so even though that's a taller building, it's perceived as being a shorter building, and it's perceived to match more closely with that single family sized building on the other side of the street or sidewalk. We can also be a lot more specific about the projections and roof elements that are allowed. What should the proper spacing between dormers be? How wide should a dormer be? The widths and maximum heights for gabled roofs, as well as the distance and widths of dormer windows or bay windows, and also things like balconies and porches. I mentioned encroachments earlier. Right now, the only encroachments specified in the code are for non-residential areas, which are city center, neighborhood center, and that allows buildings in that area to encroach past that setback line by 5 feet for things like porches, but there is no encroachment for residential areas. So one of the things we can look at is, well, do we want to allow encroachments for things like residential porches or stoops that typically project further into that setback area? And we can be very specific. We can have encroachments that apply only for the first floor and different encroachments for things like balconies or terraces that happen on upper floors. We can also control the building components that are allowed and required. So if we establish the building types that we want to allow, in this example, they're showing what they're calling a coastal cottage building type. There's a number of components that have to be incorporated or can be incorporated to comply with that building type. So for example, instead of just requiring a porch in general, which is what the existing architectural provisions say, this one says, okay, you must include a porch, but the only types of porches you can incorporate are either a projecting porch or an engaged porch. Also, bay windows are permitted, and balconies and dormers and all the different things associated with that building type that you want to include. And like I mentioned, the current regulations are very broad. It just says if you are building a neighborhood residential, you must include a porch in some way, but it doesn't specify a minimum width for that porch, the different types of porches. So here in these diagrams, you can see what I mean when I say an engaged porch versus an integral porch versus a projecting porch. And so that's something we can be a lot more specific about in the form-based code. We also have to look at the rules for off-street parking. The location of parking and the amount of off-street parking provided is already something that is regulated in the existing code, and we will continue to regulate it as a part of the form-based code. One thing we can improve in the new code is specific standards for how attached garages, for example, look like. As I mentioned before, there's no rules for how set back an attached garage has to be. It just says it has to form a separate volume from the main building, but it doesn't give you a specific distance that it has to be located away from the main entrance of the building. And so those are things we can specify in the new code. And so in addition to development standards, which are controlling where the building is located, how big it is, the overall bulk and form, we can also specify architectural design standards. And this will control things like the building composition and proportions, the windows and openings, things, special elements like towers or cupolas, porches, galleries and balconies, materials and signs, and then a specific architectural style. So we'll start with building composition and proportion. I think this is probably the most important thing that's not being regulated right now through the architectural provisions. Some of those examples that we illustrated at the beginning on those typical lots, one of the biggest issues is that there's nothing requiring a certain rhythm to where the windows and doors are located along the front of the building. And so you can end up with some awkward looking buildings. And there's a lot of composition, elements of building composition that architects are familiar with that can be codified and included as a part of your architectural standards. And these go a very long way in helping you to achieve those traditional building forms. Here's another example of how building composition and proportion can be regulated and included as a part of your architectural standards, establishing what we call center lines and expression lines for the buildings, where the cornices should be located, etc. We also can be more specific on the windows and openings, not just how much windows and openings are allowed, which you currently do have in your architectural provisions. There was that provision for, 50%, at least 50% of the ground floor in city center has to be comprised of windows and doors and openings. But in addition to that, we want to get into what types of windows are allowed. And that's something that is included in the historic district guidelines, but those again are not regulatory, so there's no way to enforce those guidelines. There's little mention of controls for tower and cupola elements in the existing code. This is something that doesn't make a lot of sense everywhere in the city, but certainly for special buildings that are built in the future where you may want to have certain elements like a tower or cupola, ensuring that there's some controls for what that ends up looking like is important. And we mentioned porches before, but one thing is defining what type of porch is allowed and how big it should be. Another thing is getting into the actual details of the porch. What does the stair leading up to the porch look like? What do the balustrades look like? And this starts to get much more into specific architectural styles. Different architectural styles have different details in how that porch is designed. There's also a materials and signs. And again, this is regulated to some extent in the existing architectural provisions and the existing code of ordinances. In particular, the city is currently updating its existing sign ordinances to comply with new federal regulations. And then finally, one of the things we can control is architectural style. This is an example of best practices used in Coral Gables for defining the Mediterranean style. And like I mentioned, there are architectural styles that are included and required as a part of Article 7 architectural provisions. There are 8 different styles listed. And so buildings in the neighborhood residential area have to comply with one of these styles. But they're very loosely defined in the actual code in Chapter 26. They are defined in more detail in the historic district guidelines, but again, those guidelines are soft recommendations. They're not regulatory. So it's hard to ensure that those styles are being properly implemented and built. There's also 2 additional styles in the historic district guidelines that are not in Article 7 of the Code of Ordinances in Chapter 26, and that's masonry, vernacular, and modern style. And you can see images of masonry, vernacular, and modern style below. And so there's a little bit of mismatch between what's in the historic district guidelines and what's in the actual regulatory architectural provisions of the code. And so just so you all are aware, what's included in the historic district guidelines are recommendations for the foundation type, the porches, the types of roofs, the windows and doors, decoration and fences that are associated with specific styles. And there's some really good information in the historic district guidelines that we now have to codify and include as a part of the regulatory portion of your code. And so just to really, bring the point home that one of the key parts of this form-based code will be taking what are guidelines, which are not mandatory, and translating those into standards so that we can ensure and have some better guarantee that the buildings that get built in the historic districts and in the traditional parts of Punta Gorda really add to the vibrant character that's already there. And in fact, improve and make it even more vibrant in the future.
Thank you all so much for coming. Like I mentioned, we'll be putting a report together of all the Q&A questions, including those that people on Zoom asked, and those our panelists online have been answering those throughout the meeting. So you can get a full report of that. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.